As an 8th grade teacher, I know how important it is to start having conversations with my students about the world outside of our classroom walls. While yes, there might be a desire to protect them sometimes, I know that it's really important for them to critically question the world around them and their beliefs around that world. I don't think this just because of things that I've read or conversations that I've had with veteran teachers, but because I know what it's like to grow up in a place where not everyone critically questioned the stereotypes that they had been presented. When I was 12, I was walking around a local supermarket with my dad. Now, to give some context, I'm half Mexican, half Filipino, and my dad's Mexican American, and he looks pretty Mexican. However, I grew up in a small town suburb just outside of Laguna Beach, California. It was mostly white, so I was pretty used to hearing racist remarks like, "Go back to Mexico," thrown at me from across the playground. Still, it was a safe place to grow up. So when this older white man approached me when I was by myself in the store, I wasn't scared. I figured that he was looking for someone, or maybe he was the parent of one of my classmates. Instead, he said he had seen me come in with my dad and wanted to know if my dad was a gardener because he was looking for someone to work on his lawn. Obviously, that was a really upsetting incident. I smart-mouthed some response to him about how my dad was probably his healthcare provider, which could have been true. My dad was a physician's assistant. And then I stormed off. My father found me outside crying, and I told him what happened, and he heard how upset I was and how terrible I thought this man was, and he talked with me about how I would have to overcome things because of my skin color and my last name. The thing is, while I know what that man did was wrong, while it's easy for the audience to gasp and tut disapprovingly when they hear that story, this man didn't strike me as ill-intentioned. He wasn't trying to be mean. His issue was much more insidious. He was ignorant. He had been told a single story about Mexican people in Southern California, that we were all workers and that was the only way we could be in his town, and believed it to be true. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being a gardener or a laborer or cleaning houses, something that my more mean-spirited classmates would tell me I would end up doing. It's that living in a world like that can make it hard to dream of doing anything else. Not seeing myself in the world I was learning about and hearing perpetuating stereotypes about my culture made it really hard to imagine what I could be. And no one really discussed the stereotypes that were faced by Black, Brown, and indigenous people of color in my studies either. Yet, I think a lot about that man now that I'm a teacher, not just myself and what I needed. Many of us have heard that wonderful talk by Chimamanda Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story. And we think that if we just learn more about previously undiscussed communities, that things will get better. And while I think that can help, I think that's part of it, I don't think that's the end of the story, and I don't think that that's all that talk is talking about. Because it's not just me as a little Filipino-Mexican kid that needed to see myself in the curriculum or have conversations about what I would face and what I had faced. I needed that man to have a deeper understanding of Latinx people and our contributions to society. I needed my mostly white classmates to discuss not just stereotypical images they'd been given of non-white people, but also to be exposed to powerful images of Black, Brown, and indigenous people in our studies, to start breaking down that single story. Unfortunately, it's an easy cycle to get caught up in, partially because we still live in a world that's mostly dominated with white dominant ideals of success or culture. This issue is particularly important to be considered if we're not from the community that we teach in, or if we're bringing more traditional forms of privilege to the table around race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status that our students might have. For example, I've been teaching To Kill a Mockingbird for the past 6 years. Now, while I think that there are ways you can teach that book that push back on narratives about Black people, it doesn't change the fact that I'm teaching about the Black community through the lens of a white Southern woman. And, as other teachers have pointed out to me, that story can perpetuate generational trauma by continuing this idea of Black people as oppressed, Black people as tragic or traumatized, instead of showing other Black voices. And it makes me wonder, what would it mean if I gave my students stories by Black authors that showed not just their struggles, but their triumphs as well? What would it mean if I centered Black joy instead of Black pain? So, When I want to have difficult discussions with my students or start talking about subjects that might make us uncomfortable, it's really important that I start asking myself some questions. The first is this the best way to enter the conversation? Should I be doing this? Is my guidance the voice that should be centered? And 3, do I need to bring in support or guidance to ensure that this conversation is structured in a way that's actually useful for students? I've long advocated that teachers should have difficult conversations and face controversial topics in education and social justice head on. I still fully believe that's true, but I also acknowledge that you really need to be prepared for that conversation and execute it well for it to be really meaningful for students. That doesn't mean that we don't have the conversation. It means that we need to consider whose voice we center and how. So let's consider, for example, if I wanted to have a conversation around the history of the N-word and why non-Black people shouldn't use it. Since I'm not Black, I can't imagine what it's like to grow up with that word and all of the difficulties and nuances that surround it. I also can't imagine the generational trauma that comes with segregation and slavery that are also tied to that word. And I would be upfront with that with my students, that I would never presume that I was the best person to lead a conversation around this, but that I also knew that we needed to have a conversation around this. And so that means that I needed to do the research and self-work to ensure that what I was doing was actually helping students and not either further burying them in levels of systemic oppression or perpetuating harmful myths about Black people. So if I consider my 3 questions above, is this the best way to enter the conversation? Should I be the one doing this? And do I need further guidance and support to have this conversation well? Well, first, for me as an English teacher, I'm already thinking about the texts that I'm using. I'm wondering if I should be centering these voices because, like I said, To Kill a Mockingbird is a text that, yes, discusses the use of the N-word, but is a white person discussing it with other white people. That's not exactly who I want to center. So I'd probably start bringing in Black scholars, texts by Black writers who are discussing this issue as a better means to enter the conversation. Historical resources such as the 1619 Project are also going to be essential for this as well. And if I had Black students, I would bring them into the conversation too, having them write and discuss with each other and our class how they felt about these issues while providing some historical guidance from Black scholars. Always work to center the voices of the people you're discussing in your conversation, particularly if that community includes your students. Then I ask myself, is there someone from the community I can bring to help us out, to talk about this? Do I know a Black teacher or colleague who might be willing to share their time with me and my students? Am I making sure I can compensate them for that work if they are? If I can't find someone to come in, then I'm going to be reaching out to people and doing research. Most likely I'm going to try and find teachers from the community that I'm discussing and ask how they might structure that conversation and also try and compensate them for that work as well. And I'm going to be reading from folks who are from that community and try and get their perspectives. Twitter has actually been a really great resource for me to meet and discuss these ideas with teachers. And hashtags like Clear the Air and Disrupt Text are outstanding groups to have these conversations and provide resources to help break down stereotypical narratives. Finally, I'm doing some serious research and thinking about how to format this discussion well. I'd likely start by giving my students some space to write and think through their own opinion on this, especially if it's such a difficult topic. Then I might have them do some paired discussions with each other before opening up to the whole class. Then I want to provide historical context and guidance, some things that might help them either broaden their ideas or deepen their understanding of the issue. Most importantly, though, I'm setting up some very, very careful guidelines and ensuring that my students understand that our focus is not just to make sure that they all feel heard, but also that they all feel safe. So guidelines like no using slurs or inappropriate language, accepting the validity of someone else's experience when they share it, seeking clarification instead of trying to win the conversation are all really good starters. I'd also acknowledge that this conversation is big and ongoing and won't wrap up neatly. And I definitely do some research on websites like Teaching Tolerance or Facing History in Ourselves, Actually, Facing History and Ourselves has a really great To Kill a Mockingbird curriculum that can help guide me on setting up some ways to explore this important issue while providing necessary context, making sure my students feel safe, and also providing some unheard viewpoints to discuss that my students and I may not have considered. As educators, many of us want to try and change the world with the education we give our students. That's a noble hope, but we need to be careful of where that intention leads us. We don't change the world by believing ourselves to be conduits of knowledge that we flood our students with. We change the world by empowering our students to ask difficult questions of the world, of themselves, and us as teachers. We change the world by caring deeply and radically for the students that we teach and centering everything around that care.